Welcome to Global Tax Talks Tax in 60 Seconds. I'm Will Morris, and expect to hear a lot more this week about Section 899, the retaliatory or so-called revenge legislation in the tax bill going through the US Congress. The US Senate released its version of the legislation last week and made some important changes, which I'll get to in a minute. But even more important than any changes is the fact that the provision remains in the legislation. So my prediction would be that if/when the bill becomes law, then a version of Section 899 will be part of it. So what were the changes? Well, before that, a health warning. This is just the Senate version, and it may change as it works its way through the Senate and or in conference negotiations with the House. That said, in this new version, the Section 899 increased withholding rates are now only activated by the UTPR. Remember, in the House version, it would also have been triggered by DSTs and the diverted profits tax. So good news for the UK in particular. Second, the Senate bill would cap the rate increases at 15%, i.e. 3 annual 5% rises. That's still a steep increase, but less steep than the 20% in the House bill. Even better for the US's treaty partners, the Senate bill makes clear that this would be 15% even on a reduced treaty rate. So now if the treaty withholding rate is 0%, then the maximum rate would be 15%, not the stratospheric 50% possible under the House bill. And importantly, given some of the difficulties we previously noted for other countries to quickly change their laws, the effective date would be pushed back to January 1, 2027. Also, interest on publicly traded bonds, cash deposits, and certain types of debt would now be explicitly excluded from 899's scope. There are also proposed changes to the base erosion and anti-abuse tax, or BEAT, in the Senate bill. Somewhat surprisingly, in all cases, regardless of the presence of UTPRs, etc., the BEAT rate would increase to 14% from 10%, but with a quite advantageous exception for payments to countries taxed at 18.9% or more, i.e. 90% or more of the US statutory rate. The less good news is that under Section 899, special BEAT provisions would be triggered not just by UTPRs, but also by DSTs. And in those cases, some of the exceptions, such as that for payments to high-tax countries, would not be available, and the provisions would also apply to businesses of any size, all at the new general rate of 14%. While the general BEAT changes would be applicable from 1/1/26, these UTPR DST provisions would be applicable, as with the other Section 899 provisions, from 1/1/27. So will this help or hinder the finding of a solution? I really don't think it changes much. The one-year delay in the effective date pays some attention to non-US concerns about the tight timetable, but still keeps the pressure on. At the same time, the rise in the GILTI rate from roughly 13% to 14% may help with concerns that GILTI coexistence might otherwise be too favorable to US businesses. And by the same token, the explicit acknowledgement about the portfolio interest exemption blunts some of the non-US business criticism that was being used to argue against 899 in any form. Now, press reports did quote a senior UK official last week talking about some of the difficulties of reaching agreement with the US, although that was admittedly before the release of the Senate bill. But we may get a better idea next week of where things stand, when several countries' officials will be speaking publicly at the OECD-US-CIB conference in Washington, D.C. Anyway, thanks for joining me, and come back next week so that you stay global tax ready.